In the dead of night, when the moon is high and ill winds blow, and the banshees cry and the moonlight casts an unearthly glow, arise, my love, with tales of woe.
Good evening. It is 12 midnight, the paranormal hour. Welcome to Ghost to Ghost. I'm your host, Chief Lawson. Ghost to Ghost is a podcast to discuss all paranormal and parapsychology subjects. You can find Ghost to Ghost on all major formats, so tell your friends, tell your family. Come listen to Ghost to Ghost. Good evening. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 1 of Ghost to Ghost. Tonight, our subject is Tupas. Now, for guests tonight, we have Jennifer, my research manager on Spirit, and our podcast producer. Say hi, Jennifer.
Hello, everyone.
And we have Heather, our case manager on Spirit and our podcast director.
Hello.
Outstanding. Start us out a little bit, Jennifer. Would you like to explain to us a little bit about what Tupas is? And again, we were just talking about this before we began the show about how it's pronounced. Depends on where you're from and your culture. Why don't you start us out with a little bit of definition and what this is, and we'll go from there.
Well, basically, a tulpa is a thought form energy ghost, usually Eastern religion and origin, mostly, but not predominantly, but not entirely. So in theosophy or mysticism, it's an object or being that is created through spiritual or mental powers. So when you will something and you meditate on something, you can create an actual manifestation of that thought.
Fantastic. Let's talk about that for a minute. You know, there was a lot of research done really in the 60s, 70s, and 80s about how much power we use out of our brain. And for a long time, there was a release, and I don't remember exactly the original origin of it, but it said that we only use 10% of our brain power. And actually, Nevada University later on proved that to be wrong. We use 100% of our brain power. We only understand 10% of our brains. And, you know, it's kind of interesting because many things are based on how powerful our brains actually are. I mean, there's been a lot of research, and this even folds over into ufology. There's a lot of claims that, you know, alien life has the ability of a higher brain function than, or more use of their brain than what we're using it for, and are able to communicate on a higher level and so forth. And you know, this would lead to the tulpas with that in mind. If our minds were such that we have that much power, which it appears we do, we would be able to create these entities if we wanted to. And this actually, you know, I've seen many instances and case studies of this. It's very interesting when you look at it.
Yeah, the tulpa idea is not really relegated to just the paranormal or the unexplained realm. Really, it falls into almost any category when you think of positive thinking versus negative thinking, mind over matter kind of thing. You know, your power of prayer for the religious sect. People really believe in focusing prayer and the healing energy and power of prayer. And you can kind of see how that would fall into this tulpa idea basis. You know, really a tulpa, I think, is when that thought actually manifests into an actual entity. You know, some people think that it can actually manifest into an actual sentient entity and have its own independent thoughts. So that's where I think that falls into that paranormal realm. That to get there, you actually have to really believe in this idea of this thought energy. And especially kind of like the core of Wicca, right, Heather? When you're thinking of spell casting, you have to put your intentions, your manifestations into that spell in order for the spell to work. That's the kind of same theory, don't you think?
Yes. That's what most Wiccans believe, and that's when they do the, like, it's called a cone of power, and that's what they use to put their intentions into the universe.
You know, and this can fade over. We're talking about religions as well. In Judaism and the Tanakh, and dealing with Christianity, you know, it talks. One of the most famous writings I can think of was done by Norman Vincent Peale. You know, The Power of Prayer, and you know, all religions inherently are based on faith, and in the faith and belief, which is a two-part factor. As long as those are there, anything is possible. And you know, the Bible was, you know, certainly, you know, with faith anything is possible. I think that the faith and the positive energy and belief can project that certainly, you know. And again, this is something that Peale had brought out in his writings, that, you know, if you have a positive energy and you apply that, you go through life positively, with a positive outlook, you're apt to have a better outcome than that which you would not. And you were talking about some other manifestations. You know, take Judaism for instance, the golem. Another.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's, you know, and of course, you know, the very first time that was really brought to light, even though it was in the Tanakh, actually in the Book of Life, it tells, you know, the formation, the process of creating a golem. But the first time it became more well written was during the German occupation of Poland, where Warsaw Rabbi had created a golem, you know, in the story to defend his village. And you know, these are seen many times. One of my favorite episodes of X-Files was a creation. And I'm always throwing off a bit on homeowner associations, but this was a neighborhood that had a homeowner association, and they created this golem. And if you didn't replace your light in your driveway lamp, this thing would come get you. You know, yeah, it was like
that was a good episode.
Yeah, like Parle Maffei or, you know, Boogeyman. You know, it'd come get you if you didn't, and they created this. There's all kinds of instances of this in writings, and you know, it's also kind of alludes the figure to be kind of metamorphic. You know, it can change, and you take, like in, for instance, Tolkien's writings, where the creature golem was not the way it was until the ring and Sauron's influence had affected it, and basically, we could say metamorphize, but it's more along the lines distorted its image and thoughts. So certainly, and of course that's what happened in the Golem story. You know, eventually, in some instances, the Golem runs wild, and the rabbi has to kill the Golem because it loses control, or he loses control.
Right.
But it is interesting. The positive thinking and the ability to project one's thoughts. You know, there's another episode going back a little older for some of my generation, is the TV show Night Stalker. Darren McGavin. They had an episode there where, and it's actually kind of folds into two things. It folds into mind projection as well as into sleep paralysis to a certain degree. But there's a sleep study going on, and this individual is creating with his mind this Cajun legend, and of course the legend's name is Parle Maffei, and it can only be killed by the wood of a gum tree, and kind of looks like a Bigfoot, and it crushes people, but it's basically the boogeyman. It's projected as a story that's told to kids that if you don't be good, Parle Maffei will get you. And it's one of those kind of things. But it does show where this student, who is in deep study, REM sleep, is being studied as creating this creature, and anyone that disturbs him, the creature comes and or anybody attempts to wake him, the creature comes after. And of course, when the individual dies, the creature remains. So the next question we have is, assuming we can create these things with our mind, if we stop existing, do they continue to exist? thought.
Right. That's interesting.
Well, yeah,
The
you
first
take.
time,
Go ahead.
this is similar along the Night Stalker. The first time I ever heard of Tulpa was when I was watching the Supernatural episode,
Hmm.
and early on they had an episode. I think it was called Hell House, but I can't remember it precisely. But there is this team of ghost facers, these paranormal investigators, who had created this whole mystique around this local legend of this house being haunted and whatnot. And things started happening in the house. The haunting started getting worse and worse. And they were putting out like Reddit threads, kind of, sort of, about what was going on in this house and what the legend was. And the more the threads were getting read and processed by people watching the episodes or reading the threads or putting in their own ideas, the Tulpa in the house just grew and changed. And so Sam and Dean's character, when they have to come in and fix this scenario, they actually go into the threads and rewrite the story for what the house is and how the ghost is affected and how they can kill the ghost, so that they can actually go in and destroy the ghost, because they actually changed the Tulpa nature of the ghost from what it was to what it became, so that they could then defeat it. I can't remember exactly how they did that. Do you remember that, Heather? I don't know. Did you watch the Supernatural
Yeah,
episode?
I kind of remember that episode. That I watched that one a long time ago. I think the first time around, but yeah, I remember that. My whole thing is like, we're all made of energy, and we're all putting this energy out for this things to happen. So that's like the guy who died, and the thing stayed. It's because he's already put his energy out into the entity, so it's already been created. So
Yeah.
When he died, it didn't need any more energy. It already had its own energy. So his energy had just been transformed already into that one entity.
Right, and then it manifested and changed as other energies got added to it.
Yeah, and as more people saw it and believed in it, it gathered more energy from those other thoughts and beliefs.
Right, right.
Well, and I think.
Did you?
No, go ahead.
You think what?
I think that, in some ways, a lot of folklore or urban legends become real in this same manner.
Precisely, yeah.
I know we planned on talking a little bit about Slender Man and so forth, but I'm thinking even more so than that. About every when we're teaching the paranormal university course, one of the things I always bring up is every town has a story of a white lady, a gray lady, one of these apparitions that walks around the roadside, and they're all pretty close to the same story. They were killed going to a prom, coming from a prom, something to that effect. And anyway, the long and the short is this individual appears, stays in the car with someone, and then, has them drive them to a certain location and either disappears or exits the car and takes off, and then, or somehow or another disappears, and they find out later through either distant relation that this individual has been killed, and they've seen an apparition. But, it makes you wonder how much of that, has gotten to the point that, it could become a mind projection entity.
Right. Well, did you guys get a chance? I know we had talked about the zombie episode, the zombie episode of Kindred Spirit.
Yes.
That was a fascinating episode, was it not?
I agree. I mean, it does open a lot of questions in investigating because, there's a lot of areas, and I found it interesting as we watched. I had seen it before, but I kept thinking when you gave me the name, I'd seen this episode before. Couldn't remember it until I stepped down and started watching it, and then I remembered it. And yes, it certainly does put a question on investigating, because when we start down that road, and actually we had something like this on Spirit several years ago. We had a case where we believed that the negative energy brought on by this one individual was creating an entity in her home. And I don't think you were with us when this occurred. You hadn't came on as research manager yet. But we had a lady and we never actually did the investigation. Never got to that point. We handled the case strictly in communications with her. But anyway, as we were talking with her, she started describing things, and she would ask us, is it possible the entity can do this and that? And then the next call we would get, the entity was doing this. Well, for instance, she asked, can the entity, possibly, it's been mostly in my bedroom, can it move to other rooms? Well, then the very next call we got from her, which was actually within about 24 hours, was, hey, the entity is now, bothering me in the living room. Where before it was not,
Right.
And we started seeing a metamorphosis, and I and Andrew, the chief of staff, we were talking about that because it seemed really odd that suddenly, now, I will say I wish I'd have thought to do what Adam and Amy had done, and that was to, introduce or suggest, hey, the ghost has tendencies of going here or there to see the next day if it did. We didn't think to do that, but it wasn't long we realized maybe her energy was the problem. And, she was very upset. She was going through, she had just recently lost a loved one, and we asked her to do some cleansing rituals to try to cleanse the house, cleanse herself a bit, and try to lose some of this proverbial luggage, if you would, that she was carrying around.
Right.
And fascinatingly enough, within a week or two of repeating this, she had repeated about 3 times, she had told us that things were great. She hadn't seen anything in a long time. The house felt less heavy. It was more light feeling. She was more comfortable. And so, but it does, I think the one thing about their episode, and I watched it, me and Heather both watched it last night, and reviewed it again. And I think the one thing that comes to mind there is you got to keep that in the back of your mind. It's a possibility. So when you walk into a haunt, and like Heather was saying earlier about, our bodies are basically one giant battery. It gives off energy. And we know through Einstein that, energy cannot, be destroyed. It can be reformed, redirected, but it can't be destroyed. So the energy has to go somewhere. And we teach this as part of our Paranormal U. And that's how ghosts are formed. When people die, most of the time, if it's a calm death that they know it's coming and they're fairly situated, cases of, I say situated, I hate to say acceptance. Nobody wants to die, but I mean, if you are to the point that you accepted the fact it's going to happen, you can't stop it, you're settled in that fact, you don't tend to come back as much as a spirit unless there's something unfinished. We talk about many reasons why hauntings occur, but still, if it lays ground and proof for why residual haunts exist, because we know that humans are basically batteries, storage vessels of energy, and things around us have the capability of storing energy. And we talk about this with certain types of rocks and water flows, that these kind of media will store images and sometimes can store them for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it makes sense. But if you look at, in the case of the zombie boy, they created that, plugged it in, basically programmed it, and there it was. Now, I and Heather were talking about an experiment we talked about one time during a Paranormal U class. I think you'll remember this, but we turned around and we talked about, you can sometimes program people, and you got to be careful of this, and this is the same thing we're talking about here. When you go into an investigation, it is so imperative to remain neutral and open to all thoughts, not only with just positive energy and positive attitude, but don't jump to any conclusions, because there was an experiment done, and basically we did this, and we turned around and told several students that we were going into this location, and we basically did the same thing they did. We invented a ghost, we put a backstory to it, and we didn't do it for the purposes of creating a mind projection. We did it to pre-bias the actual investigators, to show them not to jump to conclusions. And sometimes, and you know this as research manager, research is great, but we've got to keep in mind, don't get focused or locked on the research. Just because someone died there doesn't always mean that's the ghost. Just because someone was killed there, you still have to let the evidence and let your data bring you to your conclusion. You shouldn't drive the conclusion. And I think this is a big thing. So going into investigations in the future, we have to be careful to observe and make sure that this isn't something that's created, and it's certainly something, before we go in and we go, well, it's either it's either an intelligent haunt, or it's a residual haunt, or it's it's a and we can go through and say, well, in rare cases it could be a demonic infestation, or but now we have to add to that collective, could this be a tulpa, or a mind projection entity that's been created by the people coming and going.
Right, and precisely when you mentioned the demonic possessions and the demonic haunts, I know my belief, and I believe your belief, is that demonic haunts are extremely rare. But
yes.
There are certain programs out where they encounter them on investigation. So when you look at how those teams conduct their investigations, they're already going in expecting that. They're going in looking for that. They're going in antagonizing that. So they're going in with negative, malevolent, aggressive behaviors. So are they the ones that are actually creating their own experience and out into the space? There is observing it and reflecting it in the mirror.
Yeah, and I think that we have to watch for that, because some entities, and I know we're going to talk here shortly about the axe murders, and many entities, and in this case this particular entity, will play off of people's weakness, their ability to be shaped or molded. If an individual, especially an investigator, and I've said this so many times, if you're scared, you shouldn't go into an investigation, because a lot of entities will play off that, and it doesn't make them demons.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's just
Right.
it's something they can take advantage of, they can exploit. Same thing happens if you walk in a car dealership to buy a car and you're not ready to to stand up to it.
They always go for the weakest.
Yeah, they always go for the weakest, and I mean, and that's certainly part of it. And before we get too much further that direction, there was something funny I found, and when I say funny, it's just unique. This came from Stanford University, and it's talking about perception. And when we start talking about the mind generating things, it makes you wonder what is real and what is not. And I've seen lately on some of these shows on television that have anecdotal evidence about the Matrix, that we're all living in a construct, and these deja vu or loops are hurt, or there's some sort of damage to the Matrix, or a glitch in the Matrix that causes the slip, time slip, and so forth. And I found this, and this is written by the professor, chairman of the Stanford University Neuroscience Division. So most of the time, story of our brains generate matches that are real, physical, in the physical world. They're real, they exist, but not always. Our brains also unconsciously bend our perception of reality to meet our desires or expectations, and they fill in gaps using our past experiences. All of this can be bias when it comes to some forms of reality. Now, if that isn't something that makes you go, because you start questioning. I've known this before. I know a lot of psychiatrists who flat out do not believe in afterlife and in parapsychology. They denounce it to no end. They say that all ghosts are created in our mind, and that they are part of our distortion of reality as well as our past. And that's kind of, again, what this alludes to, but it does make one wonder, and we get that with mental matrixing. When we talk about mental matrixing, people will, they'll look at a picture, and if they want a ghost to be in it, they will find a way to see that.
Well, your brain and your eyes, they want order. They want things to be in a pattern.
Well, your brain wants everything to make sense.
And it wants to make sense. It wants things to look like a thing. Mm-hmm. Not jumbles.
And with the zombie boy, if you're expecting or hoping to get a photo, and then you get a photo that's a little bit wonky or a little bit weird, your mind automatically says, well, there it is. There's that ghost that I was looking for.
Exactly.
And then in that episode, that ghost ended up becoming Topa-like effect, which they've been adamant been able to adjust it and alter it, expand them. So
Yeah, that's how that zombie boy came. The one person's like, "Oh, that looks like a zombie boy," and then everybody's like, "Oh yeah, it looks like."
The next thing you know, he takes on the persona or the image of a zombie boy, and that's how it manifests.
Exactly.
And I think that certainly that exists, and sometimes that has to do with the energy that is there. Certainly we all have a lot of pent-up emotions that we can release in different ways, and that certainly can shape the environment. One thing that you brought up earlier when we were talking prior to beginning the episode was that of the Slender Man. Do you want to touch on that a bit there, Jennifer?
Yeah, so the Slender Man is kind of one of the most well-known modern tulpas, right? So like in 2009, this online person, Victor Surge, had a different name, Eric Kunz, I can't pronounce it.
Kunderson, I think, but don't. I've heard it pronounced several ways.
Yeah, so he created the Slender Man on that creepypasta
website
contest.
Yeah.
Right, and so the Slender Man became this popular cultural entity, and some people actually think that after all this time that he has actually become an actual physical manifestation entity. There's another one that my daughter was talking about called the Rake.
Yeah.
Very Slender Man-like, very woodsy and things like that. So
now rakes go back a little further. They're more into they've got bigger roots than the Slender Man. They always said it in the Tall Man came from the Hat Man. Okay, that sounds almost like a terrible child's rhyme. But anyway, the Hat Man. People. Yeah, exactly. They all come from that conundrum, if you will, that same mixing pot. And I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, I think images of the Hat Man, Top Hat Man, comes in several, different descriptions, has existed going back in many cultures, including American Indian. They tend to prey on children. They tend to want to collect children, and they have, they've been around a while. I mean, these things, the same thing with rakes. Rakes have been around a while. Rakes is a big Cajun more Cajun legend than anything else, and it tends to evolve around a demonic creature. And again, it depends on the culture. Every culture, there's rakes in Scottish culture as well. But the funny thing is, in the case of Slender Man, that was always thought to believe that that's where this his hacker name Victor Surge, where he got that imaging from. Same thing with the Tall Man, that came from the Hat Man sort of legend. But I think that is definitely a tulpa. I believe we have got to the point that we have made that somewhat real. If you look on the internet and on YouTube, there's videos that show where they've seen this, and now the Slender Man has 8 legs and arms.
Tentacles.
Yeah, tentacles. So I mean, I think you're seeing the metamorphosis of a tulpa. I think that's there. I mean, we had, I'm not going to say their name on air because I don't have their permission, but we've had 2 members who used to be members of Spirit, and it was a husband-wife team, and the wife, when she was growing up, had seen Hat Man. And not only on one occasion, but on 3 or 4 occasions. She was very terrified about it. She hated talking about it. And I've tried to get her to make a video several times so we could use it in training and different things. She would refuse to do it, and I understand. It's very, very traumatic, emotionally and physically traumatic for her. Even though it never really came in contact, it haunted her until she was probably 16, 17, was the last time she saw it. And one of the biggest fears she had, she shared with me right before the birth of their first son. She said, I wonder if it followed me and if it will affect my children. And one of the things I told him is, I said, if you block it out and say it won't, the good energy should help defend you. But there again, if she created them the first time, the question is will that hold over when the child's born, that would still exist for her child to view. We're talking about this mind projection, and again, it could be something that's going to stay around a while. So it's not, it will outlive her.
Positive and negative energy, and try and get that positive energy to right at
exactly,
and change the essence of whatever energy you feel is around you.
Well, and even in the case of Slender Man, if you remember, in 2014 in Wisconsin, you had the two 12-year-old girls that ended up had and of course, it was thought of as a mental imbalance, but it still was the fact that they had created this Slender Man character. The point Slender Man was giving them orders, and they ordered them to stab their friend, another young girl around the same age.
Right.
And they stabbed her 20 times. Fortunately, for her, she managed to survive. But, the two girls, I remember watching the interview they had with them, and that's scary as you can get. I mean, certainly that's in their mind, he was very real, and they were very determined. So, there's a lot of power behind a tulpa, and I think that we have to recognize that and that fact. I do believe that they have. Now, as far as the Melissa Axe murders house, you said that you were aware of two different groups or investigators that had different experiences, both positive and negative?
Yeah. So I wanted to bring this up because, if we're thinking about from energy and as a projection of our own energies that we bring into an investigation, into a haunted area. The Melissa Axe murder house is a really prime example of that, because there are certainly investigators who have gone in and immediately feel aggressive and bad and harmful entities. Again, Kindred Spirits, one of my favorite programs that is out there because of their investigation style, is point on, in my opinion.
If you're listening, Amy and Adam, that's a good plug right there. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, Amy and Adam, exactly. I mean, their investigative style is spot on, in my opinion, because they come in cool, calm, and collected. And they were talking to a couple of people who had investigated Melissa, who came in with different attitudes. One of the guys, his name was John Morley, he came in with dread in the investigation. He was already terrified of the location. And so much so that he barely could even do the interview at the house with them because of his prior experience, because he had gotten an EVP that said, just kill John Morley. This is an axe house that happened in 1912. That entity would not really know who John Morley is, but if John came in so careful of the location, whatever energy was there could have fed on that fear and bounced right back at them. The other guy, that's what I said, the guy, you guys probably have heard this before, stabbed himself in the chest, in the shoulder, with his hunting knife while he was in the He came into that house looking for the axe murder. He set the house up to be exactly the way that it was on that night of the murder, and then started provoking and antagonizing and putting his out in space. He severely injured himself. However, there are other people who have gone in, and I know that a podcast I listened to, and they took a group in. These girls are very calm, very sedate. They're always trying to look for the positive energy in spaces and try to connect with that. And they were actually connecting with childlike spirits, gentle. They had very gentle interactions that night that they were there. But again, they came in, and John Hauser is one of the investigators who has probably investigated the list more than any other, according to him. And he says whatever energy you come in that house with is the energy that you're going to get from that house.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, Honestly, again, it goes back to some spirits play off that. So if you come in and you're vulnerable, you're going to be a target. If you come in and you're pretty much positive, and you come in with a good attitude, and you're going to be a formidable force, and something that the spirit won't come right after. One thing I noticed in the episode with Amy and Adam was that the entity would come out when it was one-on-one with somebody. But if there was more than one person, it would hide and shrink back. And I think that happens a lot of times. We always say 2 in, 2 out, no less, at all. And we do that for 2 purposes. One is for safety, and the other reason is to validate whatever happens. So if one person hears it, if one person hears something or experiences something, it's one person. But if 2 are there and the other can validate what happened, that makes it a little stronger, and we can say, hey, we had a witness to it.
Makes it more believable.
Makes it more believable, exactly. And I think that, but in some instances, some entities only want to manifest. And of course there was a camera, so it wasn't like they were alone, but they weren't alone, I guess.
Wasn't completely alone.
Yeah, wasn't completely alone. It was being monitored. So I think that in the essence of that, you can do that safely without too much trouble. But you got to remember, too, there's still a safety issue. Spirits will attack if they think that you're vulnerable enough to do it. And, in that particular episode, the spirit, the maleficent, or the angry spirit, they thought was in the attic, so they're putting their back to the door of the attic, which is a extreme vulnerability. It's like letting down your shield or your guard.
It's inviting.
Yeah, it's inviting. Yes, exactly, inviting them. So it takes a lot of nerve control to sit there to begin with, but certainly it is.
And don't you think with that location, I mean, that murderer was there for just that one night, and then he wasn't there anymore. So really, the only thing that is left in that location, I don't think, is spirit. I think it is his negative energy, the output that was created when he committed those crimes. That negative energy is what is there, and
Sure.
that negative energy is what is fed into or fed off of.
Well, and I think too, it goes back to the beginning, like we were talking about at the beginning of this episode. It goes back to energy and the control of energy. And we were talking about, prior to this episode, about how different groups investigate and investigation styles. We mentioned that starting out. And certainly that helps shape these facts, these findings, these data results show us that we have to be careful on how we do investigations. And one takeaway from that certainly is the fact that, hey, if you're weak and you're not properly prepared, you're not properly trained in investigating, and you don't have the proper mindset, it may not turn out well for you. You may end up dragging something home.
Right.
You may endanger your family. I mean, I've told people before, especially when they show up to Paranormal U, one of the first things I always love to tell people is, okay, there's inherent risk here. You've shown up, okay, and you're at a site we've held the class at, it's known to be active, and you walked in the door, and at that point, you've decided that this sounds fun. Now, you may have watched it on TV, you may have, read a book, whatever the case is, and you're all ready to give it your shot at it. But you got to remember, one thing you got to take responsibility for is if you're not in the proper mindset, and you may not be the right kind of person to do investigating, it may be better. There's some people, I remember one of our students one time who only made it halfway through class just said, hey, I don't think I can do this. I think I enjoy it better watching it on TV than actually being here. And because several things had happened during the class. Now, this has been years and years ago. But still, that's a point. When you do, there is some dangers you have to be careful of. And mindset and energy are very much the driven factor to how that's going to turn out. And before I piss off every one of those TV media moguls that I'm friends with, that we're friends with, there's a lot of styles that I don't necessarily agree with. And our team Spirit, we don't use psychics. and I don't want anybody to think wrongly. Certainly we're not against psychics. My wife has grown rather fond of several psychics that, and I think you have probably too, from Paracons, and and I don't have a bit of problem with them. We don't use them in investigations because of methodology, and I think that I think probably Adam and Amy do the best use of psychic ability of any group I've seen. Rather than let the psychic guide them, they use them to verify evidence they've already collected. So they don't use them to shape the evidence. They use them as a secondary source.
And they use it blindly too.
Yes, they keep them.
Yeah.
They keep as much of a blind study as they can to that, and I like the way they do that. I'll be honest with you. There's numerous things, and without going into great detail about our methodology, which you can, we gladly will explain to anyone, but, we just don't use psychics because they're not calibratable. Psychics work on what I like to refer to as a Las Vegas average. They determine the averages of how often they're right or wrong. If the psychic is 70% accurate, then you've got a 70% chance anything they tell you is accurate, but there's no way to prove that. Whereas with a meter, if a meter goes off, something caused it to go off. We know the meter is calibrated and zeroed out, so if it gets an influx of electromagnetic field and it sets the meter off, we know something caused that field to fluctuate. Now, what it was, well, that's, a lot of people would argue that point, whether it be a ghost or a stray electrical current or, geometrical current, or it could, there's a lot of argument to that. But still, we just feel, and again, nothing wrong with psychics. I'm not, I don't want to cause any enemies with psychics out there. But anyway, and I've always been a little gun shy of them. I don't know. My wife, and I know you before, have gotten readings at the Paracons and, talk, and I think it's great. I encourage it. I don't want to go. I'd rather them not be meddling around in my head or my past. And that's another one of those strange things, And but anyway, no, I mean, so if you look at some of how the groups out there investigate, there are some of them that I certainly think, well, first of all, I'll start by saying that most of the people that I'm friendly with, I may not agree, and when I say friendly or friends with, we're talking about people we've met at Paracons that have TV shows, that have groups, and I like the individuals. I think they're very nice. We've drank with them, we've talked with them, but it gets back to the point of what you feel is the methodology you want to run with. And there's some investigations that the methodologies, I think, can probably damage or shape or maybe misshape the outcome of the investigation.
Right. Like, I think we all know who the most prevalent demonic show out there is, and you can see how they go into a location gung ho, blazing, looking for it, and the results that they get from that. The other person that we don't see very often, and we've seen John those shows, he will sometimes investigate with several people, Nick Groff and Amy and Adam, but John Tenney's investigation style, if you've ever of his episodes where he's been on, he is very calm, very laid back, very conversational. He does not get really hyped up when something happens. He does not get really down when something doesn't happen. And the results he tends to get are, I think, extremely fascinating and thought-provoking, and even the questions that he thinks to ask. He'll sit down and he'll just have a normal conversation and not really grill or investigate or, the actual entity or spirit he's talking to. He just has a conversation with them.
Yes.
Extremely interesting to watch and see how he does it and what he gets back, because he puts so much positive energy out there that he gets that positive energy back. I think the best one that I can think of right now that they did is when they investigated the location up in Wisconsin, the asylum in Wisconsin.
Yes.
Asylums and hospitals, prisons, poorhouses, they're all the massive haunted, scary locations that are on all of these episodes and programs out there because all the massive energy that are in those places, usually negative energy, right? Sadness and despair and those kinds of things, all concentrated in one area. Does that make those places more haunted because of the type and amount of energy in those places?
There's also
When John and
often
Amy and Adam
maltreatment.
investigated that asylum, they took an entirely different approach to any asylum I've ever seen. They were calm and sedate, and I'm using the word I want to use.
Neutral.
Yeah, yeah. And the responses they got back from the people was amazing because they used a calm approach to it.
Sure.
And they had a calm response.
Well, I think that, when you look at emotions and energy, which can be one and the same, all negative emotions are very strong. So are positive. I mean, they both have their scales going each way. But I think even most people, when they're down on their luck or they have bad things happen, they'll either take one or two views of that location. It's either somewhere they never want to go back to, or it's somewhere they want to go back to and show themselves they've triumphed and they've come out of there, And I remember many, 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 many years ago now, it's been almost 3 years ago, I went through a divorce and I hit rock bottom and I was living out of an apartment and it was one of the lowest times in my life, but I can still go back to that location and know that I've come quite a ways the other direction. I've rebuilt, I've recovered, things are great. Yes, it was a low time in my life, and yes, it was a very emotional time in my life, but I triumphed from that. And I think that a lot of people want to look at that. Although when you get in cases like asylums and prisons, they don't have that option. They're not going, in most cases, they're not going to probably ever leave those facilities. So they impregnate, if you will, within the media their emotions, and I think that's one of the reasons why they are so haunted. I was trying to tell somebody once. Go ahead.
Oh well, maybe not these. The hauntings are the leftover energies, because a lot of the times they weren't very well ran, and the people were maltreated,
Certainly.
and that produced even more negative energy from the people who were there.
And in a lot of cases, they knew they were being mistreated. In some cases, they didn't.
And
but they just knew they were living miserably.
And if they knew, they still had nowhere else to go.
Yeah, they couldn't do anything about it either.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
And certainly that's a good point. I know someone asked me one time. They said, "Well, why are funeral homes not haunted?" Well, I don't know that all of them are not. The late Michael St. Pierre and I were fairly good friends, and we were lodge brothers, and we'd had that discussion more than once about some locations, including a couple of his facilities. And I don't know that there isn't some, but most of the time, I think because of the fact that most beliefs within the parapsychology world is the spirit is a entity made up of energy. It has to go somewhere where the energy can be absorbed or stored. So in other words, and most people die in hospitals. Hospitals are greatly haunted. There's nothing creepier in my mind than going down a closed off wing of a hospital with just basic lighting in the middle of the night. Because God knows who's standing out watching you walk down the hall that you can't see. I mean, let's be real.
How many horror movies have been like that?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of horror movies that play off that,
Yeah, and even hospitals that are up and running, to me, are...
Oh, yeah.
I don't enjoy hospitals. There's just a sense of feeling about them.
Well, one thing I'll share is when I was back before I became a medic, and I was in my early days as an EMT at Community East, we would have to do in-service training. And back then, of course, this thing, the EED, before we called it the ER, has been rebuilt several times. But the original old configuration, they had a back hallway and a front hallway. And the front hallway had your ICE, your intensive care units. It also had, several trauma units there and then some regular rooms. But generally, unless it was a really busy night, it didn't overflow in the back hallway. But the back hallway is where the lounge was at, nurses' lounge, doctors' lounge, storage rooms. And then they had other rooms, too, extra patient rooms. But it was usually pretty vacant. The nurses' station was on the front side. It did extend to the back, but there was just a door going into the back hallway. It wasn't open where you could see people. So when you're in a back hallway, you were pretty much by yourself. And I'll never forget, the nurses' station was up at one end of the hallway near the IC units. I had to go down on the back hallway to one of the far back units. They were using a storage, one of the rooms, extra patient rooms they were using to store a few things in. They had me go retrieve something. And I remember walking into that room, and I was looking for this item. I had the light on. And the way the back was done, unless there was patients in it, every other light in the hallway was lit. So I heard a door shut. I mean, just a couple doors down, and I don't know why, but it just shot through me like a gunshot. And I immediately walked out in the hallway, and there was no doors. None of them had been open. Now, I thought maybe somebody came back also to help me look for this. So I grabbed what was requested, and I started down and started looking at a couple of the rooms. All the rooms were dark. And and I'll never forget this. As I got down and I started to make to where the door was at to go into the nurse's station, I looked behind me, and quite a ways behind me, a room light came on. And I thought, holy cow. And, call light. And I ran on in the nurse's station. I said, hey, the call light is on for a room out there. Did we put a patient in one? And they said, no, why? They said, it's on? And then they looked at their console, which it didn't show it as on, and we both stuck our heads out the hallway, and by then it was off. But, it always made me wonder. That's the only story I have of a haunted hospital.
Haunted hospital.
Yeah, and that was years ago. I mean, I was still in college, and but it stayed with me. I'll never forget that little light coming on, and ERs are very busy places. It probably came on, no one noticed it, and went right back off. I mean, and it could have been somebody screwing around with the,
with the new guy.
Yeah, with the new guy, the guy doing in-service. I mean, there's always, in the fire service, we are tons of practical jokers. So this could have been, one of the nurses had ran down there, decided to mess with me, and turned the light on, waited, I darted my head in and turned it off, and, I may have just been the victim of a lot of fun, but it does make one wonder. But certainly, I always tell people, the places that people die, we know generally produce the most chances of retaining a spirit. And generally, those have to be deaths that are traumatic. But a nursing home, hospital, asylums, places like that, you see more of it than you do a funeral home. Funeral home is where the body is stored, and we think by that point the spirit has left the body and went on, and the body is just a body. It's just a vessel that's left for display. And so, but it always brings that to mind one way or another. And it certainly, getting back to where we started with the methodology of investigation, how you approach that is going to make a big determination to how the spirits act. I remember one lecture I went through a couple years ago up at Sault Ste. Marie Paracon. I can't remember who the lecturer was, but they were talking about taking EVPs, and they said, and actually it may have been Amy. I don't remember. Anyway, but I remember one thing that was said is, remember, if this is a known haunted location, everyone's coming in and they're all asking a ton of the same questions. And this is true in the axe murder cases. Everybody comes in. Well, okay.
Why did you do it?
Yeah, better yet. Yeah, let's talk about the hatchet murders. And everybody wants to know: Did you kill your father and mother? And everybody wants to ask the same questions. Yeah, Lizzie Borden. Thank you. Lizzie Borden. I couldn't think of her name. Lizzie Borden, hatchet murders. Everybody's walking in going, "Did you kill?" Well, after. Yeah, remember, these people were real persons. They were living, breathing human beings, and they have the same feelings dead as they do alive. If you come in and keep asking the same stupid questions,
it'll drive you nuts with your dead or alive.
And, I'm sure they're looking up going, oh God, there's another group coming through to do EVPs.
Same questions.
Same questions. Did you do it? I think that the approach makes a difference in what questions you ask.
I think that's why the guy what was it, John, that does the conversational approach?
John Tenney.
John Tenney.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably why he gets such good results.
Yeah, if you approach it as you're having a conversation with them, and you have to approach it as though you're meeting them at a cocktail party. You don't walk up to somebody and go, hey,
what do you do for a living?
Yeah,
How much you make? What kind of car you drive?
Exactly. You kind of ease into things, and I think that has to do... I like to set the mode of the time frame because, and I'm sure some spirits get a little irritated, like, don't you know what hell time it is? Don't you know what day it is? Well, that helps me kind of get an idea where they're at, because, and this goes back to the Singapore theory, if they're stuck in a time period, then they're not going to relate to things from my time period, so I want to keep things orientated toward theirs. So a lot of times I start out with, how old are you male or female, some basic questions, and I think that's important. I really do, to set a ground basis, but then ease into things. And I mean, some places, I know before we have turned around and, sorry, my cat is helping me broadcast today, and decided my cord keeper decided to be a good toy. When the cord keeper was attached to my headset, he just about took off my head. And so anyway, yeah, he's always helpful, let me tell you. And so, but I think to a certain degree, you have to not only come with positive energy, but you have to come in a civil manner. It should be no different than the first time you're introduced to someone at a guest's house. I mean, you have to be respectful. I hear investigators say all the time, look, we mean no disrespect, but did you kill that person? Yeah, well, that doesn't really...
The whole I don't mean any disrespect statement.
Yeah, I remember there was a phrase by one of the actors in Boondock Saints 2, and it always starts out with, no disrespect intended, and she says, I hate it when someone says that, because when they say that, what they're going to do is very disrespectful, and they're just telling you they're going to do it, and they want some forgiveness for it, but truthfully, they're going to be very disrespectful, starting out with, no disrespect intended. Yes, it's going to be a lot of disrespect, and that's kind of, unfortunately, some of the approach. The other approach is being loud and obnoxious. You don't go in someone's house and scream. They're dead, not deaf. You don't have to scream. I've seen several of our TV investigators, our paranormal, television investigators, go in and they scream, and I'm thinking, if I'm a ghost, I wouldn't answer you. I just leave the room, and it's like having that obnoxious drunk that's time to cut him off and send him home. And, you got to be careful.
When you ask somebody to repeat themselves, and they just repeat it louder instead of clearer or something.
Yeah, we know somebody that, and luckily she doesn't do podcasts, but she's up in the ears, and when you ask her to repeat something, she screams it. I just need you to repeat it because I didn't catch all of it the first time.
Enunciate, not...
Yeah, enunciate. Yeah, let's not... and that's the problem. I think a lot of people treat ghosts sort of like we treat pets. They come in and they either that, or they want to talk down, they want to patronize them. Were you a good ghost or a bad ghost? Oh God, if I die and get a chance to do EVPs, the amount of fun I will have. I have a list of things, and there's some things that just, because of the stupidity I've seen. I don't know how many times that I and Heather have been watching TV, and I'm sure you felt the same way, Jennifer. You look at it and go, oh my God, I can't believe they just did that. And you have to have some courtesy and respect. And I think that, and for the property, you got to remember, this property, there's a, and I'm going to start, before I say that, I'm going to paraphrase it with this. There's a theory that, if a ghost dies in the if someone dies and becomes a ghost, the 1700s, their vision of where they're at is in the 1700s glasses. So in other words, they don't see a dilapidated house, they see a beautiful home with Victorian furnishings and drapes and well cleaned, and that's the way they view their home. Even though we may be walking through it without a stick of furniture and it's falling apart and there's cobwebs and creepy crawlies, they don't see it that way. So you have to have some respect.
They see it as they remembered it last.
Yeah, however they remembered it last. I always, there's a theory, and I've heard Steve mention this before from Taps. Steve will say he'll call it the Beetlejuice theory. And that is that when you die, that you want things to remain the way it is. And if you ever notice in some of the later Ghost Nations and the Rebirth of Taps, he carries around a notebook that has a cover on it that says the Handbook for the Dead, and it's a you can buy these on Amazon. They're really nifty. They're a cover that is the actual reproduction of the book in the movie Beetlejuice, the Handbook for the Dead, and it's just kind of a neat little play. But it's
cute notebook.
Yeah, cute notebook, and they sell covers for other books so you can wrap them up to look like this. But it does have some thought to it. If they're looking through 1700s glasses, again, it goes back to the Singapore theory, you want to phrase things in that manner. There was another show, I hate to keep referring to shows, but there's been some good instances, good analogies here. There was another one, I can't remember what it was, but it was a commercial. I think it was a Geico commercial, and the lady died, and the ladies died, and they were like in 1700 dress, and this one woman was there, and they were commenting on her clothing, how modern and disrespectful it was. Well, again, do you remember that?
Yeah, they're not dead.
Yes.
Yeah, it just, I think...
She bought a Victorian house.
That's right. And the women were Victorian ghosts, but she was alive, I think, was the catch. And they made little comments. But,
Yes.
You have to look at it that way, too. Your mindset before entering... It's one thing to say a prayer of protection and go charging in with, battery-operated devices and cameras, and here we come, ready or not. And, it's a much better approach, like you said, with one of the methodologies John Tenney embraces is to come in, be calm, be open, not open to the point you can be controlled, but open to the point that you're willing to look at anything. And the other thing is, I've noticed this in numerous investigators, not only Amy and Adam, but also with Jason and Steve and Tango and some of the guys that are out there and Dave Schrader and some of those. They verify what's been told to them. It's not a fact that you believe the individual's lying to you, but we have been lied to before. And sometimes it's not necessarily a lie, but it's a misinterpretation. So if someone says, hey, we think this is the ghost that haunts here, we double check that. We don't go in with that bias that we automatically think that evidence bias that that individual is the one haunting. We go in with the mindset, okay, we're going to see what we can find here, and we'll see if it is this ghost. And we actually had that happen many years ago. We went into actually it was one of our very first or third or fourth investigations. This is going back into like 2001. And we were told a certain individual was responsible for the hauntings, and this was based on the fact that his photo, which was displayed, had fallen off the wall several times, either during or closely in time relationship to something happening that they felt he was responsible for. When we come to find out, that individual never did respond to any of our testing and any of our data gathering. It wasn't him at all. And you can get that bias very quickly, as we talked about earlier. So having that openness when you walk in. So I think that, and before we wrap this episode up,
the ghost or entities haunting the place isn't always what people think is the one that's haunting.
Yeah, I think, and this is your department, research, Jennifer, but I think that research is imperative. I think it is, but I think you have to be careful not to get trapped into it. When you walk in, be aware of it, know what the research is, know what the history of the place is, because sometimes that can help you get answers, but don't let that to be your guiding light. It's not a lantern. it's a resource. And,
Yes.
I think that's what has to happen. We had a case recently, a while back, and someone kept talking about and again, we keep the ultimate privacy for our clients. We don't give out any information. But this particular case, though, the one factor was that they had and I think you'll remember this, they had a train engine that had been buried. It had been turned over or something and buried on the property, and they kept trying to link things to it. It turned out there was a possibility of a train engine being buried there that had gone, had dilapidated. They took it out of service, and it just stood there until it rusted and was done away with. But later on we found out that probably wasn't the case. It was probably removed and scrapped. But anyway, there was a lot of emphasis placed on that, and it turned out that had nothing to do with anything going on in the property whatsoever. It's a nice fact, a nice bit of trivia, but no clue, nothing to any of that. And then we've had other times where people have given us some inaccurate information. There was other times we believed that people had died on the facility. It turned out, well, we were researching not one we'd investigated, but what was it? The Rhodes Hotel, about the preacher.
Right.
Who was a legend that he had, had an affair and died there, and it turned out he lived a perfectly happy life. So a lot of times, somewhere else. So you really got to double check everything that's given to you. And I've seen this with a lot of investigators. They'll listen to everything it's said, they'll make note of it, and then they'll go research it to verify it. And I don't know how many times in the case of either taps or kindred spirits or some of the other cases where people have been working on these, especially like Dave, and I've seen where they've come back and said, well, we researched that, and that's not the case. And I know you've done that for us before. Right,
exactly. But then that goes right back, to circle around to wrap this up, that goes right back to this Tupa idea where the legend becomes so ingrained in investigators and in the community that your evidence comes back to validate that false story, because
I agree
that energy and
it
that
starts
story
manifesting,
has put out into that. Exactly.
Yeah, and I think it creates that characterization, if you will, or that entity. So, well, before we wrap this up, I'm gonna talk about takeaways from this before we're done. But Heather, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Just watch your energy when you go to investigate.
Exactly. Jennifer?
Without a doubt. Have a positive aura around you when you go in without any notions or ideas about what's going to happen. Get our clearest, best evidence out.
Exactly. I think the takeaway I'd like our listeners to really go with here is certainly watch your energy. Go in neutral. Go in calm. Go in respectful. Pretend you're going into your future in-laws' house for the first time. Be polite. Be on your best behavior. Don't come crashing in. And have respect. Remember, these were people once, no different than you and I, and that makes a difference. The other thing, which is not really part of the subject matter we started with, but I would like to say is training. Watching a lot of the television shows is not training. Before you become a paranormal investigator, I watched 9 episodes of this show and bought equipment off Amazon. That doesn't make you a parapsychology or paranormal investigator. That makes you an amateur who can get into bad spots. And I think that you see this from time to time, especially as we talked about with certain people not having the right energy.
They can leave you open
for a lot of things.
Much more than just any person off the street. Actually.
Exactly. So I think that knowing a bit more on how to investigate makes a difference. Certainly there isn't a lot of schools out there. It isn't like you can go to community college and take a parapsychology course. There are a few out there, but we encourage people to take our paranormal university course. Of course, we're based out of Indiana. We do not do that through Zoom. I actually had that question asked. I don't know, we won't at some point, but we don't right now. But if you are interested, we haven't had a class since COVID, and we are ramping up for a class and trying to get back into that circuit. But anyway, if you're going to get into parapsychology, you're going to get into investigating, know what you're getting into. Get some training, not just from the television shows, not just from the books. Talk to some of the investigators. Start out maybe having some time with a group that has some experience. I know we are the oldest parapsychology group in Indiana, and I'll tell you what, most of us have a base of at least 20 years of experience, and it makes a difference. It really, truly does. So, well, folks, that is the end of this episode for Ghost to Ghost. We hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to leave some comments and let us know how you feel. If you have some opinions, you can certainly reach out to us on Facebook and Instagram. We'd be more than happy to talk to you about anything you'd like. You can email us. Don't forget to see our website, www.spiritindiana.com, and our our email address at info@spiritindiana.com. Again, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this segment. All right, listeners, welcome to Ghost Story of the Day. Today's presenter will be Jennifer Verne, our research manager on Spirit.
The Ghost of Governor Whitcomb, from Haunted Hoosier Trails. Every librarian's dream is to have a dedicated assistant who works whenever necessary, often late in the evening, asks for no paycheck, and is 100% effective in encouraging borrowers to return overdue library books. DePaul University had the perfect librarian, a ghost. The first report that a spectral being haunted Old Whitcomb Library came in the early 1900s. Governor James Whitcomb had left his rare book collection to the school with the stipulation that they were never to be taken from the library building. A student, however, found Whitcomb's favorite book, The Poems of Ossian, which had been given to the governor as a young boy, so interesting that he slipped it out of the building, intending to read it that night and return it the next day. It was after midnight when he finished the book and turned the lights out. He awoke with a sense that he was not alone. When his eyes became adjusted to the darkness, he saw a spectral finger pointing accusingly, and then he heard, "Who stole Ossian?" The bony hand reached toward the boy, who swore he felt a finger touch his cheek. Governor Whitcomb had made his point. The boy returned the book, stammering that he'd been visited by the ghost of Governor Whitcomb and promising he'd never take another restricted book out of the library. Today, the books are housed in a new building in a secure area where only librarians can retrieve the rare volumes.
Thanks for listening to Ghost. Again, I'm your host, Chief Lawson. You can find Ghost to Ghost on all major formats on the 15th and 30th of the month at midnight. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, maybe have a question or subject you'd like to ask about on air, or be used on the show, please email us at ghosttoghost@spiritindiana.com, ghosttoghost@spiritindiana.com. I want to thank my production staff on Spirit, Jennifer Verne, our research manager and our producer, and Heather Lawson, our trainer on Spirit and our podcast director, for helping make these podcasts possible. My chief of staff, Andrew Brooks, for his guidance and help on the scripts, and everyone else involved. Thank you so much. See you next time. Until then, stay safe and remember the truth is out there. Good night. Ghost to Ghost podcast and its contents is the property of Spirit Paranormal Ltd. All rights reserved. We welcome you to download and play the podcast and share with others for personal use. You may not, except with written permission, use or distribute its contents for commercial use. Spirit Indiana Paranormal, covering the Hoosier State since 2002, Indy's oldest parapsychology investigation group. If you're experiencing what you believe to be paranormal issues, reach out to us for help at www.spiritindiana.com or call our hotline at 317-883-9103. Again, that is www.spiritindiana.com or our hotline at 317-883-9103. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself and the ones you love, and be safe out there.